Everybody, for choosing to spend part of your morning with us here at the Public Librarians Chat. My name is Daniel Cornwall. I'm the Library Technology Consultant for the Alaska State Library, and I'm filling in for Julie Niederhauser. Today, we're very happy to have with us Amy Koester, who's the Learning Experience Manager at the Skokie Public Library. She's here to give us an overview of the Civic Lab program, which offers information, activities, and discussions on issues facing the community. And as it's been a big discussion of how we can promote civility and conversations in our various communities, I'm really excited to hear what Amy has to say today. Amy.
All right. So Daniel, let me get where I can share my screen and we'll be all set.
Just made you a presenter, so you ought to be able to do that screen sharing.
Okay. How does this, oh, that's the share button. Okay. Here we go. So just a heads up that while I'm chatting and sharing my screen, I can't see any questions that come in. So Daniel, feel free to chime in if you see questions coming in the chat. We're a nice cozy group, so I'm totally down for just seeing where conversation takes us.
Great. If I see things in chat, I'll let you know.
Perfect. So hello, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Amy Koester. I'm the Learning Experiences Manager here at the Skokie Public Library. Skokie is just north of the city of Chicago in Illinois. We're a single standalone library with a bookmobile. We serve a community of about 65,000 people in a 10 square mile area. So a pretty urban, dense, extremely diverse area. We've got over 90 different languages spoken in our elementary schools. That's 90. And over 42% of our community are foreign born. So quite a range of experiences, perspectives, values, cultures, communities reflected in the larger Skokie community. And I just think sometimes that's useful context to think about as you hear about our Civic Lab initiative, why we've made some of the choices we have. And if you can put how we do things in the context of what our community looks like, hopefully that better equips you to think about, given the realities of your communities, how you would structure things, perhaps similarly, perhaps differently. Also, Learning Experiences Manager is kind of a, doesn't tell you a whole lot title. So Learning Experiences here at our library is the department that oversees public programming for all ages, so birth through seniors. We oversee learning spaces in the library. So we have a all ages hands-on theme learning space, a youth computer lab, a digital media lab. We're building a makerspace. And I also oversee the team that does information and reference. So I like to think about learning experiences. It's all the ways people learn in the library that isn't specifically tied to the materials in our collections. So I think that is a really good segue into what we have as the Civic Lab, which is a really informal kind of pop-up style learning experience for everybody to be involved in. I did not realize I was wearing stripes today as well as in that picture. Sorry. So the last little bullet point for this bio slide, I've been involved with the Association for Library Service to Children for a number of years. I actually got my start as a children's librarian in the state of Missouri. And I also, so youth services informs a lot of how I think about programs and services for any age. And I've also been involved with the online open access, open peer reviewed journal in the library with the lead pipe for a couple of years. So that's a journal that's not specific to public libraries. It's all things libraries, academic, special, and looking at critical perspectives on the issues that libraries are dealing with. So that's a little bit of the perspective that I'm bringing to my role and to the Civic Lab. So the couple of things I want to talk to everyone about today, and we'll have time for questions at the end. I want to give you a little bit of background on what the Civic Civic Lab is here at my library. How it started, what it looks like now. We'll kind of segue into the logistics of how we make it work. And for these first two sections, I can't stress enough that these are just ways that we tried things and iterated here, again, because of our specific context, our specific community. So please don't take any of what I'm talking about as like, this is the only way to do something. This is something that worked for us based on our realities. So I'm hoping that these will all be launching off points for all of you to think about what type of civic engagement work can look like in your communities. We'll spend a little bit of time on the different types of Civic Lab pop-ups we do, because it's not all just one particular type of topic. And then before questions, have a little bit of our lessons learned, because why would you make mistakes if we've already made them, and we can help you prevent doing that. So my goal here really is to just share what our philosophy and process is in the hopes that that might spur something in your process. So for us, the idea of the Civic Lab really came to be starting in the spring of 2016. So it was a presidential election year. In the springtime, there was a lot of conversation about a really chock-full primary race with a lot of candidates on the Republican side. We're going to see the opposite this year is what it looks like. So a lot of people in our community were really engaging with the news, and particularly around the election, and at a number of different service points, information desk, checkout desks in programs. What we were really noticing, and staff were reporting across the board, lots of community members who were just giving indicators that they wanted to know more about what was going on, what they were seeing on TV, what they were reading in the paper. So they wanted to understand better, but they also wanted opportunities to discuss. And so we kind of took that and thought about, okay, well, how can we offer those opportunities to grow knowledge and grow conversation around these topics? And that's how we came up with this initial idea for the Civic Lab. So we started out, the Civic Lab was a static space. We cleaned out a nook of our audiovisual area that had previously held music scores. We reintegrated the music scores into nonfiction collections and turned this little corner of the library into our Civic Lab, which focused on connecting resources, conversation starters, discussion questions, voting on 6 main topics that we had heard, again, throughout the library, that these are topics that the community was interested in. You can kind of see those on those banners in this picture. So they were Black Lives Matter, climate change, immigration, income inequality, LGBTQ+, and reproductive justice. So those were broad topics that we were hearing reference questions about. We were hearing people want to discuss in programs, and we wanted to really do what libraries do really well, which is provide focus and curated resources to be able to understand those topics in a more deep level. So I like to talk about, to this day, the Civic Lab is an opportunity for people to go beyond the little snippet of a story, whether that's a headline or a phrase that they see on the scrolling news ticker on the bottom of their TV channel of choice, to go beyond that quick snippet and understand different perspectives behind the stories that they're hearing about so that they're able to make up their own minds. So I mentioned we started with that 6 topics in that static space. And we had that going from the end of August 2016 until election night. And at that point, we knew, there was a lot of interest in the Civic Lab and these opportunities to discuss, but we weren't quite sure how we were going to continue it, but we knew that there was interest in continuing. And because, at least here in our neck of the woods, when it becomes November, that's the time of the year we bring all of our winter and holiday materials out of storage, and they had to go into that boutique space, the little nook where we had our static Civic Lab. So we didn't have a physical space for the Civic Lab anymore. So instead what we did is we turned it into this kind of pop-up model. And that's what it still is today, with some tweaks and changes over the past couple of years. So this is a picture of me 4 haircuts ago, standing there next to some of these milk crate type furniture pieces with whiteboards and pictures on them. And you can see handouts and resources on that table next to me. This is just in the main lobby of our library. And this is what a lot of our Civic Lab pop-ups look like at this point, where we pick a topic. We have staff members who curate some resources to help explore the topic more deeply than a patron might be able to find on their own through their usual news finding resources. And we engage people as they come into the library and try and see if they're interested in having a conversation or exploring a topic more. So we try and do different topics, about 2 to 3 per month. Admittedly, we haven't been hitting that full 2 per month super regularly recently, as we've just kind of done strategic planning. We're going to be undergoing a renovation, so we haven't hit as many as we've done in the past, but we still have an active Civic Lab team thinking about what topics are we hearing interest and desire to know more in our community and trying to offer those. We've also, in like the last year, looked at adding what we call rapid response pop-ups. So those, dynamic pop-ups that we were kind of our second iteration when we moved out of a physical space. We were really focusing on topics that were in the news for kind of a reasonable amount of time, so a week or more, which meant our staff who were putting together Civic Lab pop-up were able to, do a fair amount of like looking things up, research, reading a bunch of different articles and deciding which ones we're going to give a credible and nuanced and broad perspective of a topic. And as we all know in this day and age, like you don't always have that lead time with topics of civic interest. And that's when we kind of developed this rapid response pop-up, which gives our staff an opportunity to have just a regular resource that's called Go-To News Sources that is pretty much a catch-all for anytime there's a story that develops. Here's some first step strategies to find out more. And it allows our staff to go down into the public spaces of the library, have that recognizable Civic Lab branding and format and say, this is in the news. What are your questions? Let's explore it together. So in a lot of ways, taking the Civic Lab mentality merged with the idea of like an information or reference desk, that sort of information seeking training we already have as libraries and are already trusted to do, and having it with a particular civic focus. So a little bit of the hows of the Civic Lab, how it works. So right now we've got a curatorial team of 8 staff who are involved in the initiative. So I mentioned I'm the manager of the Learning Experiences Department. When the Civic Lab started in 2016, it began just with a team within my department. I was in a different role at that point. I wasn't in charge of the department yet. But we have since expanded the whole team to include folks from a bunch of different departments throughout the library. So we've got a couple of people from our administrative department. We've got some from our access services, which would be like your acquisitions and materials handling, tech services stuff. We've got some people who will occasionally join us, even though they're not on the permanent team, from both the youth and adult departments and teams. So really trying to be interdisciplinary and interdepartmental so that any staff members who have an interest in engaging community members in conversation like this have an opportunity to do so. That personal interest is really important, we found, in getting staff participation to lead pop-ups, but also to just be another person around to engage people in conversation. Maybe someone doesn't feel, whether because of their role in the library or the amount of time they have, they don't feel like they can take on a lead role for a pop-up, which would include choosing a topic, creating a resource list handout, thinking about activities, pulling resources to have on display. But we do have staff who are like, oh, this is a topic I'm interested in. If you develop the content and are down there, I'll come down and engage people in conversation with you, which has been a great thing. We've found it's really successful. The opportunities we have to have 2 staff members engaging members of the public in a Civic Lab pop-up, because we all experience this at public desks at times, that if there's one person there and you get into an in-depth conversation with that person because they have something that they need or they're curious about, while you're serving them, everybody else is kind of walking by. So sometimes having 2 people in the Civic Lab is a great benefit and engages more folks who are just happening through the area. We've also had staff who maybe it's because they come from our collections department or just really like to create curated lists, whatever the case may be. they feel like the thing they can really contribute to the Civic Lab initiative is to curate some resources, whether that's they listen to a whole lot of podcasts and can find some to recommend on pretty much any Civic Lab topic. We've got a couple of those in our library. You might have some too. Or maybe they're folks who order materials for the collection so they can connect you to a variety of resources. Having staff know that they don't even have to like FaceTime with any members of the community for the Civic Lab to still support the initiative, that like finding great resources is just as vital a piece of contribution. So how the Civic Lab works, why? So for us, you know, and maybe this is something that I should start with, for us, the Civic Lab at its crux is entirely about information and resources. It is not about the specific topics we're discussing or the perspectives. So we're never going to be in a situation where we have a topic that we're exploring with the Civic Lab and we want community members to walk away with a very specific outcome or idea. So for instance, I can pick one that's generally a not particularly partisan topic to start the example. When we've done pop-ups around genetic editing, because that's a topic that's been in the news pretty consistently over the past few years, it's not our goal for people to walk away thinking that genetic editing is good or bad, or good in these circumstances but bad in others. Like, there's no value judgment with any of these pieces. Rather, what our goal is for people who engage in the Civic Lab to gain more information, to learn things that they might have been gaps in their knowledge previously, and to really consider all of the range of information on a topic and then make up their own mind. And we found that patrons feel a lot more confident in the opinions that they hold, even if they haven't changed their opinions, you know, from before the Civic Lab interaction until after. They feel a lot more confident knowing that they've explored a lot more resources. So we've had a patron kind of early on in the project who, it was a pop-up just about the Supreme Court, which it didn't particularly matter what the topic was about. She was just like, oh, why is this something the library is doing? You know, talking about things, how the government works. And as we were having the conversation, she said, oh, I get it. Like, it's not about it's all about information, because if you have good information, you can make up your own mind. But if you have bad information, someone else is making up your mind for you. So I think in a lot of ways that connects to some of the concerns people have expressed about fake news and knowing what's credible and what's not. And, you know, recognizing for us that libraries are still a remarkably trusted resource in communities. You know, Pew Research data shows that the only folks who tend to be more trusted than libraries by the general public are medical professionals, which, you know, I will trust a heart surgeon before I trust a librarian too. That just makes sense. Knowing that people already trust us for information, we can connect that information, and then what they do with that information is really up to them. There you go. I didn't have to stumble over that quote. It's right there. Yeah, that you need to have good information in order to make up your own mind. If you have bad information, someone else is making up your mind for you. So we're really about connecting people to good information that explores the full range of topics that might only get like pro-con style treatment in the popular media. So for us, each of our Civic Lab pop-ups entails a couple of different components. You know, I mentioned that with the boutique, that first static installation in the space, it was in a space that didn't have direct staff facilitation regularly. And that was something that we found the space was lacking. So at this point, any Civic Lab pop-up, it has at least one staff person there to, you know, welcome people to the library, ask if they have any questions, have they been curious about this topic they've seen in the news, you know, to kind of weigh in where their opinion is right now. Are there questions they've been wondering? So having that direct staff member to community member interaction is really important. Every single Civic Lab pop-up, we also have a handout of curated resources. So that can include things to read, to listen to watch, to explore further, maybe some key definitions, some discussion questions. So things to for folks who maybe don't have time to spend in conversation with a staff member at the Civic Lab, or maybe they tend to like to explore things on their own, at their own pace, they have that handout that they can take with them and really dive deeper as they're interested. All of our Civic Lab pop-ups also have some sort of interactive component. So for a number of them, we've added some kind of like gamification aspects. So one of my favorite topics and like interactives is for this topic we've done a couple years and changed it up for Women's History Month, called Actually She Did That. And the entire pop-up, the concept is about women who have not gotten proper recognition for their accomplishments. So we've got our resource list that explores that topic and has things to read and consider, so people can think about what their opinion is on that topic. But for the interactive component, we had pictures with names of 10 women from history, and it was kind of a matching game. Like, can you match this woman with the description of the thing that she accomplished? And had some that were easier than others and some that were really hard, and kind of engaged a lot of people in that game. And in the process, they not only learned about 10 really cool women and their accomplishments that they perhaps hadn't known about, but they also kind of got to see, oh yeah, no, it's not an atypical thing that women didn't get credit for work that they've done. So our Civic Labs also always have a visual display. Sometimes that is a map, sometimes it's pictures, sometimes it's having a short video, just something to visually look at is really important. We've also found that we have community members who really love to see what's coming up with the Civic Lab on our library website. So even if we only have about a week's notice that we're going to do a Civic Lab pop-up, we add that to our public event calendar so that the handful of people who are on the lookout for the Civic Lab can see what's coming and plan to attend. That said, the vast majority of our events are Civic Lab participants are people who just happen to be in the library and walking past at that time. And then the last component that we have is we document what's happened at each of our Civic Lab pop-ups after the fact. So not just how many people participated, but we try and keep some general impressions about what types of conversations, what questions did people have, what topics did people find interesting, and going over those recaps in our curatorial team meetings has been really helpful in everybody thinking about how they develop future pop-ups. I mentioned that every pop-up has a curated resource list handout, so just a little bit more information on those here on this slide. So just as our kind of internal standards, every handout should have materials that are going to be accessible for a wide range of participants. I'd say the majority of our Civic Lab pop-ups are on topics that are going to be most accessible to maybe high school and older, maybe middle school and older, depending on a middle schooler's where they are in school, what their personal interests are. That said, things like Actually She Did That, where we explored women and their accomplishments, that was very much an all ages one, and we had a ton of like second and third grade girls and boys really engaged in that topic. We want the resources that we're sharing to be accessible to a wide age range, and that's one of the reasons why, if there are ever podcasts or video clips that can help explain a topic or give a perspective on a topic, we like to include those. And that ties into the having resources available in different formats. Every person who works in the library has different format preferences for how they like to spend some time learning about things. So we try to have things that run the gamut from podcasts, videos, articles, books, online exhibits, or things that we've included before, and that's really engaging for people. It's extremely important to us that everything that is included on a handout is purposefully curated by us, and we know that we've vetted the sources. We know that it's credible information. We know it's coming from a reputable source. So again, knowing that people trust the library as information experts, we want to make sure that's reflected on our handouts. And we're also really cognizant of making sure that while the intention of these handouts is for a wide variety of topics or of perspectives to be included on a topic. We never want to get stuck on the idea of only having opposing viewpoints. So an example I can give is we've had this topic that we've had a couple of times, and it's called Narratives of Gun Violence. And a lot of media portrays the topic of news around gun violence as either you support the Second Amendment or you support gun control. And that's a really reductive of opposing viewpoints perspective. And so for our handout, what we've purposefully done is look for, so when it comes to gun violence, what is a medical professional perspective? What is a global perspective? What's it like in the United States versus in other countries? What's a legal perspective? What is a victim perspective? Like trying to have a lot of different viewpoints represented so that we can avoid some of those like false binaries of like you're either for or against something. So just a little snippet of what our handouts look like. So we try and make sure that we're always including conversation questions kind of at the top of a handout after a brief description. It's important to us that those are open-ended questions, they're nonpartisan, that we're trying to make sure that they could potentially be accessible to children. Sometimes you'll even see like a family question included in the conversation question section. But giving both the staff who are leading a Civic Lab pop-up a starting place for conversation starters, but also for folks who just grab a handout and want to think about things more at home or in another venue. They have a starting place to start to consider that, again, reinforces moving beyond a like either or sort of conversation. So all of the handouts for our past Civic Lab pop-ups are available on our website, which I'll share towards the end. So if you're curious to look more in depth at past handouts, that's something you can do. So again, from an information credibility perspective, each of our resources that we connect to has a short description, a brief annotation, if you will, just to give a snippet of what's going on in that resource. And then we provide a link or call number to be able to access that information so people can explore on their own. And I mentioned again that providing different formats is really something that we found to be quite successful because a lot of people like to engage in these topics but prefer different entry paths to be able to do that. Excuse me. So a little bit more about those interactive components. I mentioned that kind of gamification where we had that matching game. That quiz style is certainly something that we've done. We'll also sometimes add like voting components. So, and it's not necessarily like vote for, against, or yes, no. We'll have things like, all right, so there's an exploration of, personal data privacy, but there are these arguments that you can consider privacy, but only considering it against convenience. And so for you personally, what is more important, privacy or convenience? Where on that spectrum would you fall? And people like using sticky notes to be able to vote. Having those discussion prompts, we have these small whiteboards that will bring down sticky notes and writing utensils for people to be able to add their thoughts. We've also since gotten a couple of rolling whiteboards, so we'll build things out, discussion questions, timelines, things like that on our whiteboards, so we can kind of do that throughout the duration of the pop-up. And I mentioned again that sometimes for a visual component, we'll have videos. And so, can be as expected as things like a Civic Lab on how a bill becomes a law and watching that I'm Just a Bill song from Schoolhouse Rock. But we've also had things like, our community does, and this is a picture from it, an annual Stand Against Racism with our local YWCA. And so we've had the Civic Lab pop up with that same question, and we've shown a video of the author Marlon James talking about what it means to be non-racist versus anti-racist. So just quick videos that can help introduce a topic. Just a quick picture of some of the visual components of stuff. I mentioned these like wooden milk crate style things that we have a dozen of them, and we can stack them, configure them in different ways to help demonstrate what's going on with our space, and also to help draw attention to materials from our collection. So the pictures and materials you see here are from a pop-up we did on endangered species. So I mentioned a little bit about our Civic Lab schedule. Please ignore the dated screenshot of past events. But as I mentioned, we try and put everything on our website, not only so that patrons can know about it, but then it's part of our event software, so we're able to record attendance and have a running measurement of how attendance is going at Civic Lab pop-ups. And from each of these links on our website, a person can click to find out more about that particular topic, but they can also access the curated resource list handout. So some of our community members who really like the Civic Lab but don't necessarily feel they can come in for each topic they're interested in, they can still access the resources. So talking a little bit about the types of Civic Lab pop-ups we've had, one of the major types we have is just that kind of basic civics education. So I mentioned how a bill becomes a law. You saw a snippet of, what is the EPA? So basic things like just how the government works. How does the Supreme Court work? We've had one like, what is FEMA? Things that we hear people asking about, whether it's community members specifically asking, or maybe it's things that we see starting to be explored in local newspapers or on the news, and we can help dive a little bit deeper. For something like how a bill becomes a law, there's always conversation, it feels like, about legislation that is happening at a federal level or a state or a local level. And so that is a really familiar topic. And then also countering the familiarity of the topic with a lot of, especially parents and older, were really familiar with Schoolhouse Rock. And so having that clip playing really brought in a bunch of people. And then they stayed to participate in kind of a matching game of do you know the steps of how a bill becomes a law? Can you put them in order? Something like, what is the EPA? One of the things that we did that we hadn't done a whole ton in the past is paired not only nonfiction, which is, you can feel like a really obvious thing to include on curated resource list handouts, but also adding in some fiction titles as well that kind of resonate with the themes of a Civic Lab topic. So one of our materials selectors got involved with the Civic Lab, and that's when we started adding in additional types of library materials on these handouts. So a second type of pop-up that we really do are issue discussions. So that's those ongoing topics of conversation, maybe that have relevance for potential policy. So things that aren't necessarily fixed to a specific news cycle, but that continue to develop and pop up. So endangered species and genetic editing being two examples. So for the endangered species conversation, we've popped up a couple of times as the topic has come up in the news. We found that it's a topic that a lot of people in our community really want to know about or have an opinion about. And so we really engage people from all types of backgrounds, all ages, because it's something they're interested in. And the first time we offered this pop-up was at a time when the presidential administration was considering lifting a ban on trophy hunting. And that was getting a lot of news coverage. And so a lot of people were just primed to have a conversation about endangered species and learning more. And I mentioned a little bit earlier about genetic editing. This topic came to be first and foremost because we had a number of staff involved with the Civic Lab who were super interested in the topic after hearing a couple of podcasts about it. And admittedly, that's how a number of our policy or issue type Civic Lab pop-ups come to be, is because a staff member heard something or read something that piqued their interest, and they started to dive a little bit deeper and found, hey, there's a lot more going on with this topic than I realized, and there might be more than other people realize too. So that's an example where we started to build a Civic Lab around one specific resource. And so we've done, at this point, broader topics of broader pop-ups on genetic editing in general, but also some more specific ones on the gene editing technique, CRISPR. Our third major type of pop-up is those timely news topics. So things that are in the news, getting a lot of coverage, but people might only get kind of a surface level of information about them. So examples like what is FEMA, which just continues to be relevant as hurricane seasons continue to worsen, executive orders and immigration. And then I mentioned a little bit earlier about the rapid response pop-ups, which I can mention a bit more. So for what is FEMA, that was a timely, but also how the government works topic that we started offering in fall of 2017, which is when there were a couple of really bad hurricanes. We anticipate potentially popping up again as there are more natural disasters that require FEMA response in the United States. We had a lot of people in our community with questions about like, so what is the reporting process to get support from FEMA? You know, what about this type of disaster? And so there were a lot more questions on this topic than I think we were anticipating. So great opportunity for us to use those ready reference skills and help figure out answers live the same way we would at the reference desk, just without the desk. For executive orders in immigration, this was actually one of our earliest pop-ups that we did in January of 2017. So that was at a point at which there were the travel bans that were being called the Muslim bans because it was restrictions for visitors to the United States from 7 Muslim majority countries. And so for this particular topic, this is a technique we've used for other topics as well. We've looked at what's happening currently in the news and how does that compare to something that's happened in the past. So we looked at coverage of the travel bans contemporarily against the executive order that led to the incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II, and looked at what's similar, what's different, what's the coverage, what was the coverage then, what is the coverage now, and kind of diving in from that perspective. And as I said, having those rapid response pop-ups so that when a topic erupts in the news, we really can respond quickly if we see that that's something that our community is asking for. I mentioned that go-to news sources handout that has just a couple of tips for info seekers, and then also includes starting places for if your story is local, start here. If it's national, start here. If it's international, start here. If it's business related, start here. We always bring down a library laptop for those so that, again, we can kind of do that ready reference without the desk. And as community members have questions, we can investigate on the spot, which allows us to not only answer their questions, but also model credible information seeking live, which can be a really positive tool. And I can't stress enough that having like any sort of Civic Lab pop-up, but the rapid response ones in particular, it's just like working any other public desk. You don't necessarily know the sorts of questions you're going to get, but it's an interaction the same as we have at any other desk in the library, and so staff approaching it from that perspective. A little bit about our lessons learned so far, and then I will share some resources and we can get to some questions. So I mentioned earlier, but I can't stress enough, we found that facilitation is really important and that we need to kind of seek people out or invite people in during pop-ups. So just being kind of in a main thoroughfare of the library isn't always enough to get people to engage. And we have some staff who are better than I am, certainly at welcoming people and saying like, hey, have you been hearing about this in the news? And saying it in a way that is inviting as opposed to like confrontational. So that facilitation is really key. One thing I think we've learned the hard way a number of times is to resist the urge to overcomplicate things. So when it comes to like putting together a curated resource list handout, it's not about having the perfect resources that expertly explain all of the different perspectives. Rather, we know our resource lists are going to be credible and curated, but from a certain perspective, they are also still just a starting point. They're the tip of the iceberg when it comes to all of the information that a person can find on these topics. And the last lesson learned is, flexibility is key. And because you work in a library, you're probably prepared for that already because, no 2 days are the same. You never know what kind of questions you're going to get. And we found it's really helpful to go in with a general idea of, what are some potential conversation starters or discussion questions we can have ready for a Civic Lab pop-up. But if, when push comes to shove, a community member really wants to take a different approach or explore a different avenue than we were planning on doing, we're ready to pivot and do that. And again, that's using that skill that we've honed at service desks throughout our library work there, where we're going to see what sort of information needs the patron has and then respond in kind. So this link here at the top, skokielibrary.info/resources/civic-lab, that is our Civic Lab website. If you Google Skokie Public Library Civic Lab, you should get to it as well. And that's where I mentioned it's got the calendar of our upcoming events, as well as the roster of all of the past ones. And if you click on individual past events, you can also get to our past handouts. And then this is my contact information. If you have questions after our conversation today, please feel free to reach out to me. I do want to mention that one of the resources Daniel is going to share out is both these slides and also our Civic Lab FAQ, which is a frequently asked questions document that we've created for other library professionals who are curious to know more, some of the specifics, how the Civic Lab works, how we've approached staff training, all of those pieces. So that is a useful piece for you, perhaps. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, so I will be able to see questions.
Very much, Amy. So far, we haven't had questions. So we'll have questions. So they can type them into chat, or you can probably unmute yourselves and go ahead and ask them. Any questions for Amy on the Civics Lab? Things that I was impressed by, it makes sense, was you really need to have the facilitation piece. Need to have somebody there with the resources to kind of get people to engage.
Yeah, and I'll admit that's something that we found with our community, but that could also just be really specific to our community. Depending what type of interaction folks in your community are used to in your library, that might be different. We have a whole lot of public programs here at our library, and every one of those programs has a person at the front of the room kind of leading a format people are familiar with at the library. And we don't have as much in the realm of passive even displays. So people aren't habituated to that idea of this is a way to interact in the library unless there's someone there leading it. And that's something that we decided to lean into.
And one question that I have for the recording, if not for everybody here, is do you have some thoughts on kind of the minimal number of people you might need to carry this out? Because it sounds like you've got a staff of 8, and some libraries here in Alaska might have some number from 1 to 4.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think you could do this with a single person, and it would just be a matter of being thoughtful about what that one person has the capacity and resources to do successfully. So, one of the reasons we started out with that goal of 2 or 3 topics a month was because we had a larger team. There have been some where, only 2 people are really able to dedicate time to the Civic Lab, and we only have 1 topic that pops up, and that's totally fine. For smaller libraries, during summer reading is probably not a time that you're going to have a lot of capacity to do this, and that's totally fine. I think for those libraries, you don't necessarily think about it like you need a team. I think a way to think about it is that you could think about the Civic Lab as a style of program that you do, and how do you currently support programming in your library? Who does that? Could that person periodically, maybe once a quarter, think about leading an event that looks more like discussion, topic exploration than it does whatever a traditional program looks like? I think any format can work. For us, it's just always really about how do we connect people to more information so they can be more informed citizens or more informed residents, and feel confident in their ability to make a decision.
Okay.
And I see a question here. Do we mind if you borrow the name Civic Lab? Absolutely not. Please take it. You have our permission to also use the graphics if you like the word treatment for Civic Lab. Just if you ever find yourself in a position to present about it, we would love it to credit, the Civic Lab at Skokie Public Library. But yeah, do not reinvent the wheel if you do not have to or do not want to.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Other questions while we've got Amy with us? We've got at least another 10 minutes that we could use for questions if people had them.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Robert, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Great. Well, first off, thank you, Amy. This has really been interesting. In the generation of the resources and the information that you provided to patrons in the context of the Civic Labs, did you ever have any patrons either object to resources that the library was providing, or kind of in that same vein request that you include specific resources that you wouldn't have deemed credible?
Yeah, so both of those have happened, absolutely. And what we try and do as a rule whenever that happens, first, if someone comes in and says like, oh, well, I heard or I read, and it's something that to our like information ears sounds not particularly credible, we'll try and turn it into a conversation about like seeking resources. And so it won't be like, well, I don't think that's right. Instead, it'll be like, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that. Where are you getting that information? And then turning it into a conversation about, where do you choose to get your information? Have you ever looked at like finding a second source to like verify? So not trying to put particular pieces of information under check for whether they're credible or not. Like we don't want to do that in any sort of accusatory way, but trying to turn it into an opportunity to think critically about the resources people use. When it comes to things like our go-to information sources, go-to news sources handout, we looked at the Pew Research Center research they had done about the perceived bias of different news resources. And so knowing that, research shows that there is a perception of liberal bias for the New York Times, and there's a perception of conservative bias for Fox News. Like we actively didn't put those resources on that, like, this is where you can start for your information resource, because for someone who has a particular bias against one of those resources, doesn't trust them, if they see that one thing, there's less of a chance they're going to engage with any of the other resources because they might think that it has the same bias, same bent. So looking at some of that data about what tend to be resources that don't come with that sort of perception of bias. And we're always really trying to focus on it's a collaborative aspect. So like when we ask one of those open-ended questions, if someone wants to share something that they've read or heard that maybe isn't credible, it's clearly added in a like crowdsourced context as opposed to being on the formal curated resource list handout. So we found that people are generally pretty well satisfied to be able to talk about something that they've found or like make a note about it, but aren't really pushing us to get it on the like quote unquote official handout sort of thing. Let's see, a couple other questions. What tips do you have for vetting the information? So that's a great question. And what we've done when we've had new staff come in to either learn about the Civic Lab or really participate in it, we'll go back to some of the like basic reference skills training. So how to go beyond a pro-con argument, how to triangulate your resources to see like, can you verify something twice? And then if you can, is that, you can be pretty well assured that it's credible. So using some of those traditional reference skills to vet info. The other question, how much staff time do we currently commit to this project? It's not a set amount, and it really varies from staff member to staff member and throughout the year. So we have a team meeting about the Civic Lab every other month, and that lasts about an hour. And I'd say most of the folks involved in the Civic Lab at this point, they're spending maybe 2 hours a month total thinking about it. Maybe a little bit more if it's a month that someone is actively leading a Civic Lab pop-up. Like for me personally, if it's a month when I'm going to be leading a pop-up, I spend about, I don't know, maybe an hour seeking out resources to put together on the handout. Our handout has to go through our proofreading process here in the library, and then I'll spend between an hour and 90 minutes actually leading the pop-up. That's maybe quicker than some other people are, but I've also been doing Civic Lab pop-ups for 3 years now. But it really varies from person to person. And then a question, do we have any project outcomes that we're measuring? So we have, as I mentioned, kind of gotten, part of our process is to document after each pop-up conversations that we've had, interactions, types of things that worked, types of things that didn't. So we don't have any formal outcomes, but we have just kind of kept running track of the fact that at most pop-ups, not necessarily all of them, but at most pop-ups, we'll have people engaging in a conversation for 10 minutes or more, which when we've then had a follow-up question asked, we'll find like that's something they've not had opportunity to do in another venue. So an outcome in terms of an opportunity to engage in a more in-depth information-based conversation than they might otherwise. So they have an opportunity they wouldn't have otherwise had. And also looking at things like just anecdotally hearing people say like, oh, I didn't know that, or I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. And so these indicators that the Civic Lab is not only connecting people for resources than they might have had access to in the past, but also potentially impacting how they think about a topic. So like change in knowledge, perhaps change in attitude.
Related question, have you been tracking attendance, participation over the life of Civic Labs, and have you noticed trends in that?
We have tracked it. There's because we're not super consistent with like time of day or day of the week. It's really hard to suss out any particular trends. Like in terms of a range, for a 1 hour Civic Lab, we might have anywhere between like 4 and 20 people stop by. That has more to do with foot traffic through the library than topic usually. So for us, like as just a general rule of thumb, we're considering it really successful if we have about one conversation every 10 minutes. So, 6 people in an hour. And some of those people, it's just like a quick 2-minute conversation. They take a handout and they leave, but others it's more in-depth. So, well, obviously, outcomes and measuring success is really important. That's not the biggest metric of what we're looking at for continuing the Civic Lab. As long as people who do participate express, an appreciation for getting to engage in these topics or being glad that the library is, we hear a lot of people say like, oh, it's so great that the library is doing this, like more libraries or more places should do this. Like for us and our library strategic plan, that right there is reason enough to continue doing it because our community has said they want to be more civically engaged. And even just if the library seems more visible as a place to do that, that's a win for us.
Thank you. We've got about 3 minutes left, so I'd kind of like to put out a last call for questions and give another thanks to Amy. This has been really good information and great to see people like engaged with issues and topics at your library.
Yeah, and I know in Alaska there's a lot been going on around like funding that directly impacts libraries, and I've heard tell from friends in Alaska that that's motivated a number of people in communities to want to get more involved so they can better understand and advocate for libraries. And I think you've got great opportunity there to kind of tie in. So I see the question, is there any particular way we choose our topics? It's always a combination of things that we're seeing in the news, things that we're hearing at public desks that people are asking questions about or talking about that we feel like, oh, because a bunch of people are talking about this, this could be an opportunity to explore more deeply. Topics in the news that we feel like there's more to stories than is generally getting shared. One example we developed pretty quickly last summer. So in 1 week there was the suicides of Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, and there was a CDC report that showed that incidence of suicide in the United States is up. And so for us, it was like, okay, these are just headlines, but like let's go deeper and like understand a lot of the topics around like suicide conversations, legislation, why we should say died by suicide as opposed to committed. And also wanted to really connect people to mental health and support resources in the community. Connecting to resources in the community is about information the same way as connecting to like facts. So that was really important for us.
Well, thank you again, Amy. Really appreciate you spending some of your afternoon with us, and appreciate everyone who dialed into the webinar to participate with us. And we will do our best to get this recording posted in the next week or two. I'm one of the people who usually posts the recordings, and I'm out most of next week. But certainly by the first week of October, we should have the recording up along with Amy's slides and FAQs. And so if you email me, I can send you her contact information, which she had in her slides if you didn't already send it out. And we'll make an announcement of that when we post the video and other materials. Thank you very much, and have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.
You guys too. Bye-bye.